Okay, welcome again today, everyone, to our fifth session on how to lobby and advocate with your governments for youth inclusive financing. Today, we have a very special round of speakers who will be speaking about this topic, have experience working with their governments and lobbying for climate and the energy, clean energy sector. And without further ado, I would like to hand over to Jorge to take it over from here.
Thank you very much. Let me just find a couple of things here in order to introduce our speakers. So I will ask each one of you, in starting with Katharine, to tell us a little bit about what you do and how it relates to lobbying for youth financing. So if you could please start, we'll have 5 minutes for each one of you to give a brief introduction of your work.
Hi, I'm Katharine. I'm a volunteer with Citizens Climate Lobby, and I've been lobbying the U.S. Congress for a national carbon fee and dividend legislation. And so some of this includes we go to D.C. to meet with them with a team of CCL volunteers, and then we also meet in district or on Zoom with both offices. And we come in with our policy and answer their questions and show support from our district. And then on the other side of that, we go back to district and work on building support among their constituents so that next time we go lobby, we have more to show them and drop off with them. I've also been working with a school group to lobby local leaders and asking them for an endorsement of the federal bill.
Right. Thank you. So next, can Jesse Young from Climate Oxfam America, can you tell us a little bit about what you do and what you do for your organization?
Yeah, I'll be real quick. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining today. My name is Jesse Young. I work on climate policy at Oxfam America, which is a global justice-focused and anti-poverty nonprofit that works in over 90 countries in the world. Briefly, I've worked all over the place before Oxfam. I spent 8.5 years working in Congress as a policy advisor on climate and energy issues, 6 years in the House, 2.5 years in the Senate. I then spent 2 years at the State Department with the Paris Agreement team during the Obama administration. And I've been at Oxfam pretty much since then, working on a lot of things, but primarily international climate policy, how to defend the international climate system, make it stronger, make it more inclusive, defend it from Trump's attacks. And I've sort of done this work from inside government, in Congress, in both chambers, in the administration, and now as a pressure group on the outside. So excited to be here today. Thanks for having me.
No, thank you. And thank you for the brief intro. Can we now have MaryJane Enchill? I'm sorry if I mispronounced it. Deputy Chief Executive Officer of Hatof Foundation. Can you tell us a little bit about what you do and your organization, please?
Okay, thank you very much, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone from wherever you're watching from. My name is MaryJane Enchill, and I'm a Ghanaian. I work with an organization called Hatof Foundation as the Deputy Chief Executive Officer. I also the Assistant National Coordinator for the Climate Action Network Ghana, and then also I coordinate the National Global Youth Biodiversity Network in Ghana. So basically, my work has been in community-based actions and then engagement in the broader environmental governance and climate policy processes, both at the national and international level. And what I will quickly say or briefly is that we have been able to contribute to the global policy processes, especially within the UNFCCC, the UNCBD, and then the UNCCD. We've also, apart from contributing to the global policy at the national level, we also try to influence and support national policies that respond to sound environmental management. That notwithstanding, because we also do some form of community-based actions, we are also engaged in implementing and monitoring implementation of sound environmental policy activities within the country. So basically, my organization has been supporting both the public and private sector institutions to plan, to assess, and also to deliver multilateral finances for environmental protection activities in Ghana. We have been engaged in a lot of activities. I know that once we go on, we'll be talking about some of the activities or the lobbying experiences we've had in going forward. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for being here. So lastly, but not least, Kiran Jivnani, who works for the European Parliament. Can you tell us a little bit about what you do and how it relates to financing for youth, lobbying for youth finance?
Yeah, sure. So my name is Kiran, and I currently work for an MEP in the European Parliament. I work within the Socialist and Democratic group for MEP Miriam Dalli. And basically, the key areas that I work on are environmental issues and health issues. And a big part of this is obviously getting the youth involved and kind of hearing their different perspectives because they have a lot to offer. So I basically work on mainly the policy side of things for my particular MEP, who is extremely involved in the climate arena.
Okay, thank you. So now we're gonna move on to the first question. Maria, could you read those first couple of questions we have for the speakers?
Yes, sure. Okay, so we're going to dive into the first two questions are going to be directed to Jesse from Oxfam, and then also to MaryJane. So I'll start with Jesse because you said that you've been working with Oxfam, and the question is, what has been your experience lobbying for climate and energy with Congress and with the private sector, obviously, and how has Oxfam been able to push for the private sector participation in bankrolling global climate action? And the reason we are asking both about your work with Congress and with the private sector is because a lot of times the private sector is left out in climate action and climate change strategies, and you probably have great experience working in this field. So over to you, Jesse.
Yeah, it's a great question. Thank you for asking. Generally, when I think about finance and climate in the private sector, in the past, where we've had great success as a movement in recent years is getting companies and private sector actors, generally speaking, to focus on their emissions internally, their scope 1, 2, 3 emissions, to make sure their supply chains are greener, they're not making the climate crisis worse by the way they operate internally. The stuff that's been a lot harder, and I know everyone on this is no news to everyone on this call, is actually been getting them to make their corporate voices as a political actor more salient to the climate movement. Obviously, what a company does within its four walls is mostly its own business. What it does, how it, through lobbying in DC and state capitals and with other peer actors in the corporate space, is really different. And that's been much tougher. Some companies have withdrawn their membership from the US Chamber of Commerce, which is essentially a climate denial organization doing the bidding of fossil fuel companies. But are companies willing to come to Congress and go to state legislatures and say, hey, not only do we believe in climate change, not only are we putting our money where our mouth is in our internal operations, but we think you should spend more money to tackle these things. Now, in state legislatures, that's a really hard case to make for international climate change and climate finance, and I know we come to that later in the agenda. But when talking to the federal government, it's a very real concern. And there are some groups, nonprofits like Ceres, based in Boston, the Business Council for Sustainable Energy, the We Mean Business Coalition. And these are NGOs that just exist to get companies to push governments to take more aggressive climate policies, and a lot of the times around finance. And that's how I work with them, which is to make sure that when you go to your federal interlocutors and you're asking them to be stronger on climate change, don't just talk about adaptation and mitigation policies and regulations, push the federal government to actually spend money. What I focus on a lot is foreign aid. Get the State Department and USAID, our National Development Agency, to spend more money overseas, because that's where the greatest need is, especially on adaptation. Of climate money spent overseas, most of it still flows to mitigation, because you can securitize it. You can make money from it. If you build a solar array, it generates funds. That's securitizable. Adaptation, if you're building a seawall or you're moving a transformer or you're helping a community avoid agriculture impacts of climate, there's no revenue flow. And so that's where governments really need to step in, and I think where a lot of companies are lagging. And I think it's a place where youth voices can be really effective, because this is a moral question as much as it is a policy question. There's security arguments you can make about preventing conflict and preventing resource competition. I think the most powerful arguments in a lot of the ways are those that making the case that we have a moral obligation here, largely because we've caused this problem. When I say we, I'm speaking for the United States, but also more generally for the OECD and the developed world. We have the capacity to do something about it. We have the financial resources, and we have responsibility. So I don't know if that answers the question, but I'll stop there.
I mean, that's an interesting way that you've put it, and like the background for America and how America can really lead the way. And I guess I would like to ask a similar question to MaryJane as well, which is your experience in lobbying, because I know you've done a lot of work with political leaders in Africa, including with your home country in Ghana. So maybe you could share with us what your experience has been pushing for climate action and pushing for financing for youth-led action. MaryJane, we can't hear you if you're speaking. Maybe you could unmute your mic.
I think she may be having some trouble with her connection.
Okay, it appears as though she was having some technical. Okay, I think she's coming back on. Let's just see if she can hear us again.
I'm back online.
Sorry about that.
Yeah, very sorry too. So let me first of all say that my experience has been very frustrating and challenging. Unlike other parts of the world where you have easy access to your political leaders and they are willing and ready to listen to you, it's not very much the same in this part of our country or in this part of the globe, which is Africa. So my experience has actually been very challenging and frustrating, has never been smooth. So lobbying for ambitious action, I want to pick this issue. I look at it in three folds. I look at the ambitious action part of it. I look at the financing bit of it before maybe I zoom into the GCF, whether or not its structure is okay for youth-led initiatives. So I'll first of all say that in the attempt of trying to lobby for an ambitious action on the part of the African government, what we have always been faced with, or the mantra, is the idea of we are not responsible. The mantra of we are not responsible has actually been hitting back at us almost all the time. And to a large extent, you would agree with me that they may or they may not be right, in a sense that considering putting all the African countries together, the 55 African states together, their contribution to emission is less than 3%. So if you ask African government to increase ambition, the question is, what am I increasing? When in the first place, our contribution is very, very low. So they find it a bit difficult or reluctant in trying to increase ambition. And then also the issue of scarce resources is also another factor that deters them from raising ambition, because the point is that with the limited resources that we have, which is also to be used for other national projects, which is maybe infrastructure, health, providing healthcare facilities, and elevating poverty and all of that, you cannot be seen using that scarce resources to increase ambition or what we call reducing emissions. So it is actually a challenge to kind of convince state leaders to be able to increase ambition. The other issue has to do with the economic implications. We are very mindful of the economic implications in raising ambitions. Why am I saying that? The fear of collapsing economy, the fear of people losing their jobs are some of the things that actually deter them from raising ambition. They may want to do that. Let me give you an example. For instance, the idea that we should keep fossil fuels on the ground. When you come to Africa or a place like Ghana, for instance, the fossil fuel industry, which is also dominated by the transport sector, has a lot of youth in the transport sector. A lot of youth driving because maybe they don't have any corporate job to do, and so they go into driving, and the cars they are driving are all fueled by fossil fuel. So if government is cutting fossil fuel, means that these cars that use fossil fuel will not be used again. They need to be replaced by other efficient cars, like say electric cars. So again, if we are shifting from fossil fuel cars based on the fact that the government wants to raise ambition, that it means that a lot of people must lose their jobs in the driving sector. So again, just opposing some of these implications on the economy and the livelihoods of the people sometimes make it difficult for political leaders to want to raise ambition. And then also, again, you see, whilst they are doing all of this, they're also looking at re-election, being elected again into office. And so they are comfortable implementing political manifestos rather than any other thing, because they have signed an unwritten social contract with the people to deliver on certain promises. So when they come, their interest is in ensuring that they fulfill that social contract signed between themselves and the electorate. So again, which has nothing to do with emission reduction. So if you are coming in with this lobbying to reduce emissions, which is going to affect maybe some employment sectors and all of that, there's a bit of resistance there. So it's a bit challenging. That is the issue on raising ambition. And then also, with regards to the financing, I would say that the point is lobbying political leaders in Africa for financing, climate financing is a daunting task, because one, the leader you want to lobby to maybe increase financing for climate ambitions does not have the resources themselves. Even if they do, these resources are loans that comes with conditionalities. And these conditionalities do not make room for the youth to be part of it. It is not carved with youth in mind. So again, you see that we go for resources or loans, procure loans, that you cannot even employ the youth in anything. So again, some of these are the dynamics that actually hinder the political leaders in trying to raise ambition, either for financing or maybe activities on the ground to respond to climate change. Those are the challenges we've actually been facing. And so I would want to say that the point is, since most of the African leaders are also not donors to the multilateral funds, it's also very difficult for them to make an intentional provision for the youth in financing activities. So that is what I would say regarding the raising ambition. I experienced how it has been. It has been very difficult, and with very convincing reasons why they may do that at their own pace and not want to raise so much ambition for anything, basically. Yeah.
Yeah, that's very interesting, MaryJane, what you said, and I can see a similarity between the challenges you're facing in Ghana and also the challenges Jesse faces working with the U.S. Congress here. And I guess I just want to ask both of you this question, which is, because I know you both know about it, about the Green Climate Fund. Do you think it's ambitious enough, and do you think it's been structured effectively to finance youth-led action or climate action that's spearheaded by youth organizations? So either MaryJane, you can go first, and then Jesse, you can you can answer as well.
Okay. Okay, that's fine. For me, I think the straightforward answer is no. The GCF is not structured effectively to respond to youth initiatives. First of all, what are the structures? We need to look at the structure within the GCF. GCF is a financial mechanism to the UNFCCC, and it finances adaptation mitigation, which we all know. And they are looking at ambitious projects, paradigm shift projects. And the challenge is that these funds respond to only the public sector and then the private sector. There is no room for the youth. Because if you go to their portfolio, the project portfolio, you notice that of the, let's say, I think about over 128 projects that have been implemented, the government or the public sector has about 70 or 64 to 70%, and then the rest is for the private sector, nothing on youth or CSOs. So looking at the structure itself, serving government and then the private sector, the youth is nowhere to be found. And then the structure, I would say that only respond to big projects and not youth are engaged or involved in. For instance, you look at the minimum project size you can assess within GCF is 10 million US dollars. You ask yourself, in Africa, or let's say even Europe, how many of the youth organizations can implement a $10 million project from GCF? So the project size itself is a disincentive for the youth to engage with the GCF. That is number one. And even with the GCF already noticing some of these challenges, even with the countries not being able to implement that kind of amount of projects, then they came with the simplified application process, which means that you can access from a minimum of, let's say, $1 up to $10 million. But it also has its challenges. Where I see the youth can take an opportunity is within the readiness. But again, the readiness, which is to support countries to be able to put certain policies in place to engage the GCF, is also looking at the national designated authorities, which is also a public institution. So the readiness is serving a public institution. So until the youth gets to the NDA, they cannot assess anything from the GCF. And even if the NDA would want to use a delivery partner in implementing the projects they have, the funds they've received from GCF, they need an implementing agency or a delivery partner that is accredited to the GCF. So that if you are an institution that is not accredited to the GCF, you need to show that, okay, you have the financial management assessment, you go through what we call the financial management assessment, something like that, which you need to demonstrate your capability of implementing the project on behalf of the NDA. So again, even if the NDA wants to engage the youth in implementing that project, the youth cannot be seen as managing the funds the NDA will get. Let's say the NDA gets $3 million, $300,000. The youth cannot, implement that. So maybe where the youth can actually engage within the GCF is to lobby the NDAs to access some finance from the GCF, and then those resources will be applied by the youth to be able to do some basic projects that they are into. Because as it stands now, the grant size is not favorable, and then also serving the public and private institution automatically takes out the youth. So the bottom line is that there's no dedicated fund within the multilateral process or serving the climate change convention that responds to the need of the youth. The JEF doesn't do that, and the adaptation fund does also not do that. So it's very complicated. Unlike when you go to the GCF, where they ask you to show evidence of engagement with civil society organizations, and then to show that you've been able to engage the civil society organizations, the youth are not mentioned. And if you go to the JEF, it is the same thing, where there's a deliberate attempt to engage gender, and gender is only looking at mostly men and women, maybe you say the youth are there, but it's very, very silent. So some of these things or the structure within the system itself is not favorable for the youth to be able to access GCF funds in any way. That's what I can say.
That was great and a tough act to follow. I wouldn't disagree with anything MaryJane says. Just to explain some of the context, I think the Green Climate Fund, when it was created a decade ago, essentially was designed to try and learn some of the mistakes of past funds, specifically the climate investment funds. And its mandate was to be transformational, right? To fund big projects that fundamentally alter the agriculture system of a country, the electrical system of a country, or water management in a country. And I think MaryJane is totally right that in a lot of countries, you don't start there. Project development is half the battle. You don't have funding to look at a country's economy and their society and their health system and then figure out the intervention that makes sense. That's why I think GCF has struggled for several years with a lot of countries just taking their old stale World Bank proposals and then refitting them for the Green Climate Fund, when in reality, what the Green Climate Fund is looking for new and additional and path-breaking and exciting projects, and we're still getting some of the leftovers of the old system. I think the Green Climate Fund is aware of this. MaryJane referred to the Readiness Program, which is one of the places that youth can access the fund, but the project threshold is obviously important. And as she says, the folks that submit projects up to the Green Climate Fund are ministries in countries. So accredited entities can provide projects up to the countries, but the countries are the ones that take the projects to the Green Climate Fund. So it is tough. As with everything in the UN system, it's countries that intervene in the Paris Agreement and all these places. And it is tough sometimes to get youth involved in those. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much for those thorough answers about what's going on with the GCF and how this can actually be accessed by youth in different ways, or how it cannot, or how it's difficult given the structure for youth to get more involved. Now I want to switch a little bit gears and move over.
I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry, Dolphine. I think you were having some technical difficulties, so we're moving over to the second round of questions. I'm going to be asking Katharine and Kiran a little bit about their motivations to join and how they're working with their respective organizations and their respective spaces in order to make an impact on policies. So starting with Katharine, by the way, we will have about 10 minutes for each one of you. So starting with Katharine, I want to know a little bit more about what drove you to get involved with lobbying your members of Congress for a carbon fee and dividend with CCL, and why a carbon fee and dividend, and how you think this could impact on these topics we're discussing, or financing in general, access for youth financing. What are your thoughts on being involved with CCL and what we do at CCL?
All right, thank you. So when I was like 12 or 13, my dad started doing a lot of research about climate change, and he realized how bad it was. And he saw something on Citizens Climate Lobby's website that said, join us in Washington to lobby Congress to address climate change. So he signed up, and I just kind of tagged along with him, and I didn't really know much about it. I just thought climate change sounds like a good cause, so my dad's going, so I might as well go. And then when we were lobbying, the offices of Congress would have these questions and concerns about a carbon fee and dividend, and just thinking through answers to them and trying to poke holes in it myself has made me realize that I think it's a really good solution. So that's motivated me to keep going for it. And I guess for why I'm doing it, I mean climate change, it needs a global solution, but given the government system, I think a national solution with a national policy with global reach, like carbon fee and dividend, is a good way to do it. So I feel like I can do my part in New Hampshire, where I live, to ask my congressman to co-sponsor this bill. So it's kind of funny. The first time I lobbied, I just expected, I was like, we have this great bill. It makes sense. It will help address climate change. And seems like they would just learn about it and sign on. But it turns out there's a lot that goes into these decisions about what congressmen do, just besides what is a good idea itself. So Citizens Climate Lobby's mission is to create the political will for a livable world, which I thought was just like a marketing thing, but it's actually so true. Like, political will is just showing support from who the legislator trusts, like, or who they need support from, like their congressmen, their constituents who voted for them, their donors, businesses in their district, and things like that. So I guess why carbon fee and dividend in particular. Overall, I like it because it's a bipartisan solution that's effective in addressing climate change and is also good for people and the economy. So I guess just as we trust climate scientists for the science and of the problem of climate change, like, I think it's good to trust the economists for like what the solution should be, because they're the experts on like an economic solution. So this is a solution they recommend. It starts with a carbon price, which economists say is the most effective tool in reducing carbon emissions. And the carbon price starts low but increases steadily every year. And this method incentivizes green investments and green long-term thinking without shocking the economy right away, because everyone will know that fossil fuels are going to be more expensive, so they won't make long-term investments in them and stuff. And then for the dividend part, it takes all the money collected from the fee and distributes it to citizen households equally. And this helps low-income households and protects middle-income households from the temporarily increased energy costs during the transition to clean energy. Low-income households generally have a lower than average carbon footprint just because they can't afford to buy lots of extra things and travel all over the place for fun. So they get more in their dividend than they pay in higher prices to the fee. So this helps the low-income households. And another thing I like about the dividend, like the full dividend, the 100% going to people, is it allows the fee to grow higher because it won't hurt people with like making carbon-based products and services more expensive. And a higher carbon price is more effective in reducing carbon emissions than like incentives like from that the government could do with the money, like buying solar panels or something like that. So the third part is a border carbon adjustment, and this is what makes it a global solution, because a carbon adjustment puts tariffs on trade with countries that don't have a matching carbon price, and this protects jobs in the country, but it also incentivizes other countries to price carbon. The EU just announced they're putting a border carbon adjustment on their equivalent carbon price of about $27 a ton by 2023. So that is hopefully helping the US congressmen want to get our carbon price at least that high so we don't have to pay the tariff. And the carbon fee and dividend bill in the US Congress starts at $15 per ton of carbon dioxide equivalent emissions and increases by an additional $10 a ton each year, which will get us into the World Bank's suggested carbon price range of $50 to $100 a ton by 2030 to meet the Paris target. And I guess this kind of made me think it sounds like a good idea, but then some studies have been done on the bill and the policy, and the benefits they found have really convinced me to put my energy into this. So it will reduce US carbon emissions by 40% in 12 years and 90% in 30 years. And some other like side benefits are that the additional spending low-income households can do with their dividend creates 2.1 million jobs or net jobs in 10 years. And the reductions in local air pollution save 295,000 lives in 10 years. So I know like complementary policies will be needed in addition to a national carbon fee and dividend, but I think it's the single most effective step in addressing climate change. So that's why I'm lobbying for it.
Thank you very much, Katharine. I do appreciate you mentioning number one, the political will to do policies, to not just present a policy that makes sense or a policy that is backed by scientists, either economists or whoever else. There's a lot more to this political decision making, and I also like that you mentioned that carbon fee and dividend will help with protecting the most vulnerable and make them better off. So that's one of the key parts of this policy. Now, switching to John, what was your motivation for getting involved in working for the climate in the EU Parliament? And in your opinion, do you think there is enough incentive and commitment within the European Parliament to finance a green economy and youth-led action?
Sure. So thank you for your question. And to start at the top, in September of 2017, my island, St. Martin, was hit by Hurricane Irma, which at the time was the most devastating Atlantic hurricane in history. So when that happened and I saw all of the destruction that my island and my people had to suffer through, mentally, physically, even economically, I kind of knew that I needed to go into this field. And I very quickly realized that these elevated storms and these natural disasters that we were seeing, and in fact are still seeing all over the globe, are extremely linked to climate change. And although I'd always been kind of passionate about climate change as a topic and a cleaner economy, this realization kind of sparked something stronger in me. And it really led me to work for climate in the European Parliament. So as I mentioned before, I currently work for the Socialists and Democrats for MEP Miriam Dalli, and I'm able to see action being taken every single day within the S&D party in the parliament. In my experience, I think that within our party, there is a lot of commitment to finance a green economy and definitely a lot of incentive to take youth-led climate action very seriously. However, I wouldn't say that this is true of every single party within the parliament. The good news is this is gradually changing, and the call for climate action has really increased, especially since the COVID-19 pandemic and the realization that if we don't handle our climate problems now, we're going to be seeing a lot more of these disasters, we're going to be seeing more of these pandemics, and we will face extreme economic problems as a result of it. So overall, I think that the incentive and the commitment is rising every single day, especially the commitment to the European Green Deal and the pledge to be climate neutral by 2050. I think that does have a very good chance of becoming reality. That said, though, I think there's always more that we can do, and this is where youth-led action becomes extremely important. Young people today are dynamic, they're smart, they understand how to use their voice and how to channel it to start movements. And I think a large part of why governing institutions are increasingly taking climate more seriously is because of the youth and because they have sparked these movements. So this is definitely the time to keep pushing for climate accountability from all elected officials, whether that's in Europe or America or pretty much anywhere in the globe, because as everyone has already said, this is a global problem and it is one of the most important ones.
Thank you, Kiran. Mariah, I think, do you want to move on to the next round of questions?
Yeah, I think I'll hand over to Dolphine to take on from here.
Hi everyone, I'm sorry I'm late. I had a bit of technical issues here and there, but I'm glad that we have a rich panelist, and the next set of questions is actually something I'm personally looking forward to. So to MaryJane and to Kate, I have this question. We know that you've worked you've worked at the state level, national level, and regional level. That is basically to say, for MaryJane, for you, I know you've done a lot of work with the AU, and I also know with the EU Parliament and also the US Congress. So how has that worked out for you in pushing for issues of green financing, especially for the young people? So if you could just elaborate to us, how has that been for you at the regional, especially I'm curious about the AU and the EU Parliament. How has that worked out for you?
Okay, let me just say that the experience is not different from the national level. You know, already African Union is not a negotiating bloc within the UNFCCC, unlike the European Union. So again, if you see the European Union pushing for something within the UNFCCC, African Union is not seen as such. What we see within the UNFCCC process is a group of African group of negotiators, or let's say negotiated from the 54 countries, meeting the 55 countries, meeting and then deciding on something that they may want to do. So it has been a very, very challenging step to take, in a sense that within the negotiation bloc of the African group of negotiations, it was just recently that they introduced the young negotiators within the African group of negotiators. So I cannot speak to African Union as a body within the UNFCCC, because African Union does not go into the UNFCCC as a union. It is just the group of negotiators, the countries that go there and then organize themselves to put up a claim. But even with that, once there have been some experiences that, or information that we have got that goes to we've observed that within the negotiations, the African group of negotiators themselves, they agree to disagree. Sometimes you lobby for a position and then you may not know what will happen. Then by the time you get to the negotiation room, then decisions are changing among the countries. And the challenge with this is also had to do with the language barrier, or the language within the group of negotiators, which is the French or the Anglophone and then the Francophone. So there's this, and then the Portuguese. It's very challenging. I really don't know how to explain to you, but we have not been very, very successful with lobbying the African group of negotiators to be able to increase ambition or financing. Because if you go to the government of Ghana's negotiation team, the challenge they are expressing with why they cannot increase ambition is the same expression from the government of South Africa. So from north, east, west, and south, we have the same challenge confronting all of us. And then since we all go with individuals, how do we call it? Ideologies or preferences, or yes, let me put it that way. It's a bit difficult to be able to get them together. But even the attempt to get them together has always been faced with some sort of challenges. But I should say that we can give them a plus, in a sense that inclusive youth engagement within the African group of negotiators has been seen for the past 2 years, which is within the COP20, the COP in Poland, and then the COP in Spain. We have had some youth being engaged within the African youth group of negotiators. So I would say that that is a building block, or a step that we can actually enhance on to get them to increase ambitions whilst the youth are there. But it hasn't been easy, let me put it that way. So if you ask me of the African Union, that is what I can say to the best of my knowledge.
Okay, MaryJane, I really like where this discussion is headed to, and yeah, it sounds like even at the not just before we get to the youth aspect, even at that how do I say, government level, intergovernmental level, there is no much coherence within the African countries. Basically, issues of language barrier are coming into play, and it's really interesting because I'd want to know maybe if I could pick your brain further, have you engaged with, there's this group, there's AMSEN and there's Kahosk. Where do all these two groups fit in within the Africa negotiations? And then there's also the AMSEN one. And then how do they, because in my, sorry, I have very little understanding. They're supposed to build up towards the COP, but as we've seen,
Yeah.
when Africa, as a continent, when we get to the COP, we have different voices. We decide, we agree here, we're as Africa, then we go to the negotiation rooms, then we all speak different languages. So how, just to touch on it a bit, how do these structures build up to each other to lead up to the COP negotiations? Yes, please.
Okay. Well, I won't attempt to speak for the KAHOSOC or the AMSEN. I won't attempt to do that. But what I know is that, yes, the AMSEN is the African Ministries of Environment, Ministers of Environment meeting to chart a path for the continent of Africa as far as environment is concerned. And the KAHOSOC is also made up of the head of states also discussing issues on climate change and maybe what they want to do as far as climate change is concerned. And so the outcome of KAHOSOC meeting and the outcome of AMSEN meeting is supposed to inform the negotiators of Africa within the UNFCCC. Okay, that is what it is. And I wouldn't say that the fact that I'm saying that there has been some challenges with language, and sometimes you see that we are disagreeing on one or two things, does not entirely mean that they're actually not doing anything at all. I mean, you see the African group of negotiators within their Greek negotiation team and adaptation and all of that, trying to push for something, because in Africa we say that adaptation is our priority. So I will say that it's hand in hand. I cannot say they are not doing anything at all, but I'm only expressing the challenges that they face there, which are very, very genuine challenges. And so lobbying them to take a decision or to chart a path that the European community will be charting, it's a bit difficult because our circumstances are different, our capacities are different. So if you are saying keep the fossil fuels there, and you are advocating this within your government in Africa, you don't expect them to just get up one day, leapfrog, and then keep the fossil fuel there. They'll give you all the reasons why they cannot do that, which is also very, very instructive. Let me quickly say that, you see, the fact that we have a challenge within the negotiation as Africa, it's also emanates from the fact that I think we are beginning to understand that the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities with respective capability principle that we talk about has an expression of the recognition of common challenge and then the recognition of different capacities. And so it is expected that you will commit or you pledge, your commitment should be equal to your capabilities. But what has actually been happening is that, you see, backdoor, I know my European counterparts will agree with me that sometimes, in as much as the common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities, the principle is there to guide us. At the back door, we are preaching an absolute decoupling of the economic sector from environmental degradation, where the African group is looking at relative decoupling. We cannot just jump into decoupling our development from environment. We have to do it gradually. But if you come back door using let me give you an example. You know, in Kyoto, the difference was clear between Africa and Europe, where commitments, as far as Africa is concerned, was voluntary, but the European community was actually asked to cut emissions to a certain level. But now, the principle of common but differentiated responsibility and respective capability within this era, I would say, has been defeated, which I think most of the African governments are also aware of, in a sense that now we do not have the partition again. We have all been brought on the same table for the young and old to fight together to fight for a common cause. So if you meet an African government who believed in Kyoto Protocol and has been made to commit in the Paris Agreement or the NDC, what they can do is what they have done. They cannot be seen increasing too much of an ambition to be able to do something. So for me, I'll say that they have a genuine case, but we are also trying to lobby them to see reason with why we need to increase ambition. But it has to be very gradual, let me put it this way. So I don't know if I've been able to answer your question, but that's what I can say as far as the AMSEN, CAHUSOG, and the African Group of Negotiators are concerned, and why we see the challenges that we are seeing.
Okay, I think, thank you, MaryJane, for that very expansive description of what happens behind the scenes when negotiation is happening. And this question really is actually a question to all our panelists who would also like to share their experience on this issue. And I know, Jesse, you've been very active in lobbying Congress. So I just would also want to know, from your perspective, whether you have similar challenges as MaryJane has expounded on, or a little bit different.
Sure, yeah.
Maria, before Jesse answers, I just want to conclude. I have to add one small bit. Yeah, I agree that the fact that, sorry, I touched on Africa a bit. I agree that the fact that we have challenges doesn't mean that the African countries are not doing anything. Because I know, for say, there's a group called AFDAN, Africa GCF NDA, and they're trying to sort of bring that sort of coherence within GCF focal points across the continent. So yeah, I actually agree with you. It doesn't mean that there is actually there's nothing being done. I think there's a lot being done. So maybe I can now push over to Jesse. Yes, sorry for the interruption. Jesse.
Yeah, and Jesse, sorry to interrupt you, but there's also a similar question from Sam Duan. He says that he's lobbied some politicians in the States and shares the same experience lobbying with Democrats and Republicans. And then he also is asking you what your experience has been on the floor in practice in successfully facilitating cooperation for progress. So if you could tie that into your response, that would be great.
Sure, yeah. A lot to get to there. So in terms of Congress, when I worked in Congress, I took thousands of these meetings, and since I've left Congress, I've been in maybe hundreds of them going to Congress. So just drawing on my personal experience and speaking for no one else, obviously. When you're talking to Congress, and I think several other folks, Katharine alluded to this, you're not just making the argument, you're not just trying to make the strongest argument on the basis of the issue you care about. So if you're talking about climate change, you're not just going in there to talk about how transformative the policy will be, or how many tons of carbon it will reduce in the atmosphere, or what the health impacts will be. You want to make an argument that is focused on the member. Staffers have 8 to 9 issues that they handle. Climate is just one of them. They may care personally, but they have very little time. So you want to make it in terms of, how does this make the member look good? How can they stand out? Why is this member particularly suited to focusing on this issue? What, they're from coastal Florida, or they're from an area that's experiencing flooding, or there's a company in their district, especially important, that is producing a green solution to this problem. Members also really care about being left out. If everyone else that's in their general cohort ideologically in their caucus is doing something and they're not, that's a very powerful tool. I just used it yesterday with a certain senator from Massachusetts saying, everyone else is doing this, you should probably be doing this, you're going to look stupid. I think it is also important to have a really focused, clear message that makes it clear how this is achievable. I can promise you, over the course of thousands of meetings, every single person that comes into a members of Congress offices says, this is the thing that's going to change it all. This is going to guarantee your reelection. This is going to make you a star. you won't believe how important it is for you to get behind this policy because it's going to be great for you. 99% of the time, that's just not true. And so you need to have an argument that actually recognizes who you're speaking to. I think the number one mistake that a lot of people when they lobby Congress is to go in and make the same argument in front of every single person they meet with. If it's not tailored to the office you're meeting with, you're probably wasting your time. If you're giving them the same handouts, if you're making the same argument, if you're using the same language, if it's not tailored to coastal Florida, inner Maine, upstate New York, southern Texas, the Panhandle, it needs to feel like you care about their boss and their participation. That's just general Congress tips that I would add. Also on the state level, something that's been really interesting that I've gotten involved with recently is Massachusetts, liberal or northeastern state, is trying to become the first state in the union that will allow its residents to donate directly to international climate finance. For those of you that traffic in this stuff, you probably know that mostly it's just countries that can give money to, say, the Least Developed Countries Fund or the Green Climate Fund. In most cases, private citizens and corporations cannot do this. So Massachusetts is looking at a way to let individual Massachusetts taxpayers, when they get their tax refund every year, giving some of that money to the Least Developed Countries Fund through the state of Massachusetts. The state of Massachusetts is a government, so it can sort of get around those issues in a way that an individual can't. Now, this has gotten gummed up in the legislature this year because there's a global pandemic and the budget is a nightmare and every state legislature is running out of money and it's a crisis. So it's slowed down a bit, but it's one model at trying to find a way to let individual citizens be part of the international solution to the climate crisis. Because as all you guys shouldn't assume, as most of you know, since the president announced he was going to pull out of the Paris Agreement in 2017, there's been a flowering of subnational climate action. Cities, states, businesses, tribal councils, civil society pledging to do what they can within their own congregations, county lines, state borders, reduce carbon emissions, which is great. But as we all know, that's somewhere around half the battle. There's an enormous amount of warming that's baked in the atmosphere. So we need finance to go overseas to help a lot of the poor developing countries make those reductions. And right now there's no subnational action to finance. No government, state government right now can defend pushing money overseas when there's dramatic needs for schools and roads and childcare and health benefits. So going directly to citizens is another way to do this. Now, it's not going to generate billions of dollars. It would only generate millions of dollars if other states took this up. But it's one conversation we're starting to have, which, God willing, Donald Trump doesn't win re-election. But if he does, we need to have a conversation in the United States about how we generate more money for overseas climate finance, because the Paris Agreement doesn't work without it. No international climate regime, the Montreal Protocol, ICAO, pick your thing. As MaryJane was talking about, there are a lot of countries that just don't have the money. They want to introduce these policies. They want to pursue low carbon futures, but they need technical expertise and they need financing. And if we're not stepping up, and I say we again on behalf of developed countries, the whole system doesn't work. There's no way in which we don't provide the finance to back up these commitments. It can't just be developed countries reducing their own emissions. So it's a long rambling answer, but I'll stop there.
Maybe Kirani can give us her perspective on the same question from the EU side.
Yeah, definitely. So I think a lot of the points were already made. One of the toughest things to do is get all of these politicians to agree on the same thing, especially when they're all coming from different political parties. So I'm fortunate enough to be working for a political party and frankly for an MEP who is extremely progressive on climate change. But that doesn't mean that every single person shares our perspective. The point is to strike a deal that kind of encompasses everything while being progressive enough. And that is extremely tough to do. Those negotiations take weeks, if not months at a time. So when you're kind of in a situation like this, especially with the COVID-19 pandemic right now, it becomes increasingly difficult to find a good avenue to create actual change and financing for climate change. Now, developed countries kind of have the upper hand on this. They have the means to finance this. Developing countries, on the other hand, don't necessarily have this and therefore cannot push for the same level of ambition. So I think a big part of this entire sort of puzzle is figuring out a way where developed countries can not only finance their own climate neutrality, but then provide incentives for developing countries to also hop on board. And again, this is so difficult to do because it's not only in the United States where you have polarized political parties, right? That exists in most countries, and of course it exists within the European Union. So when you're trying to strike a deal with people who have complete opposite perspectives from you, and you realize that, you know, they care more about a different side, maybe it's the economic side, then you kind of have to figure out which way to go. Another thing to really realize is that when you're trying to strike these climate change deals, leaving the economic side of it is one of the worst things that you can do. You have to account for the people who are going to be the most affected by these policies, and a lot of times they are the people who are in the low income bracket. You have to find a way to make the transition just and fair, whether that is providing reskilling, whether that is providing upskilling, whatever the case may be. This climate transition isn't just for one particular class of people. It has to be for everybody, and it has to be done in an extremely fair and just way that leaves nobody behind, that hurts no one, and that provides a new economic future. And I think the way to really do this is to literally structure, and this is kind of what the European Union has been doing, and you know, the European Commission has already put out a bunch of statements on this, and so is the S&D party, is kind of structuring the new economic scheme of the European Union around climate justice and climate change and digitalization. So it's really putting those two things together as opposed to referring to them as two separate things, because they are so interlinked at the end of the day.
Yeah, thank you, Kiran, for answering that question. We have like another subset question. I'm not sure if we answered it in the discussion, and maybe someone would like to answer it, but I don't want to forget our dear Katharine. If you also would like to share your perspective, especially because you're a young person, lobbying with Congress or state senators, what has like been your experience, and maybe the kind of challenges you faced pushing, especially for the carbon fee dividend?
Yes, thank you. So I guess at the most local level in the state, we have a like group of kids who have been meeting with like prominent people within New Hampshire and asking them to endorse the national carbon fee and dividend. And we just send them an email or call them and ask if they'd be willing to meet with us. And then we meet on Zoom and ask for an endorsement. And I guess also locally, I've testified at a public hearing that the legislature's energy committee was doing on an energy bill. So that's another way to get your, like, make people listen to you. And then nationally, I go in with like citizens climate lobbies, lobby teams, and we kind of have a standard meeting format and roles. There's like everyone introduces themselves, and then we show appreciation for the legislator's office to set the meeting on a nice tone, and then make sure it starts and ends on time. And we have a primary ask where like clearly state straight out, we're here to ask you to co-sponsor the national carbon fee and dividend bill and things like that. So I guess a success we've had is my New Hampshire Congressman Representative Custer became a co-sponsor of the bill in January. And also, I guess when I started this, it was just a policy. It wasn't a bill. But since then, the bill's been introduced in Congress, which was really exciting. And yeah, the challenges is, especially like Kiran was talking about, with advocating for a bipartisan solution when it's so politically divided, but trying hard for a bipartisan solution because we want it to last through election cycles. Yeah. Should I give like advice from what I've learned, or are we doing that later?
Yeah, we're going to do that later because we're going to ask everyone. But then I also want to hand over to Dolphine because I think she had a couple of questions as well.
All right, thank you.
So and also other speakers, but I'm curious to know, because I'm very impressed with the way you've worked with the legislators and the congressmen. So have you been able to work with them to make them understand the urgency to invest away from fossil fuels? Because you've mentioned that it might be different people come with different regimes and different ideologies. So in your line of work and in your experience, which is quite still impressive at the EU, either at the national or at the EU level, have you been able to convince them to understand? Yes. Yes, it's for you, Kiran. Yes.
Okay,
And then
okay. I
also
just wanted to make sure.
Oh,
Okay.
yes.
Okay. So I wouldn't say it's me personally that has made them understand something, but I will say that thankfully in the European Union, science is a great motivator. And I know that's not necessarily true of all countries. But for the European Union, one of the best ways that you can kind of convince people that this is a real subject that needs to be handled right now, otherwise there will be dire consequences moving forward, is you show them that the experts are on the same page with you. And for the most part, I think most of the people I've worked with, because again, I'm in a very progressive political party, but even across the arena on other political parties, do understand that this is a major threat to all of society, no matter who you are. It doesn't matter your gender, your age, like the amount of wealth you have. This is going to affect you. If not now, then in the next 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, it doesn't matter. So really, that kind of realization and just knowing that these are the facts being put out by experts, I think is one of the best motivators, especially in the European Parliament. Again, the main disagreement is how do you reach this deal, right? How do you make sure that no one is being left behind? Industries, people, like you don't ever want to endanger anyone economically, especially right now with the COVID-19 crisis where everyone's already endangered economically. So you kind of really have to realize that it isn't so much about motivating people to get on the same page. It's about motivating people to see your perspective of the same page and kind of jumping on it together and finding a solution that works for everybody, but also a solution that is future proof and that can last for at least the next decade.
Just to add something on a bit, in your experience with the EU, I don't know how the EU politics and how it goes about. Do you have some political parties, for lack of a better term, that are sort of green parties, pushing for the green agenda? Just it is like the green aspect becomes the main motto, main focus. Something, yeah, I'd like to add. Yes.
Yeah, so I'd say there are multiple political parties. And again, the way EU politics works is you don't just have the European Parliament, you have the European Council and the European Commission, and they play a huge role in our politics, particularly the Commission. So right now, and again, this is largely because of COVID, the way that the EU seems to be moving forward is they want to structure their entire economic frame on tackling climate change and on the New Deal. So it wouldn't necessarily be only specific parties, although again, that also does exist. So my party, the S&D group, is extremely, extremely strong on climate action. And frankly, it's one of the reasons why I decided to work for that political party and this particular MEP. It's because that's something that I was passionate about. And I knew that if I was able to work in this area, I would be making a concrete difference and also hopefully providing a youth perspective.
Thank you very much, Kirani. Katharine, would you like to say something?
Sure, thank you. So, it's in the US, it's hard because there's a lot of fossil fuel industry money influencing Congress, and not everyone, but science isn't necessarily valued as much as in the EU. So, a few things we've had that have worked a little bit I can share are local impacts, like the congressmen care about how it's going to affect their district. So like, are we going to get a bunch of refugees from Boston from sea level rise, and there's going to be stronger hurricanes, and New Hampshire's economy has a lot from like the ski industry, but we're kind of right on the line of where there's enough snow, so we'll be losing that money and that'll hurt the economy. Also, if the congressman isn't like, if they don't want to hear about climate change, don't think it's a problem, you can also focus on the local air pollution effects of fossil fuels, just because there's other problems with fossil fuels too. I don't know exactly how many deaths they're causing a year, but almost 300,000 lives could be saved with a national carbon fee and dividend just from air pollution. So there's a lot of problems with that alone. We also talk about personal stories, like people talk about their kids getting ticks more now, and like I Nordic ski on my school team, and we've been on roller skis pretty much all winter. We haven't had snow at school, and the fossil fuel companies have tried to put like a gas pipeline, so how that's like affected people whose like neighborhoods it was trying to go through. And then I guess the other thing to emphasize is that like climate change now is not like it's not huge compared to how bad it's going to be in the near future, even if we stop burning fossil fuels now, because like the delay between when the pollution is released and when we see the effects, there's another like 0.4-ish degrees Celsius warming built in anyway, and just how we're going to pass tipping points and it's just going to get exponentially worse, because if people are just like looking out at the impacts now, they might not see the urgency that it really needs. And then one final thing is Climate Interactive and MIT put together a policy modeling tool called En-ROADS. It's EN-ROADS. If you want to play around with it, you can slide levers to try different policies at addressing climate change, and just giving that to a legislator and asking them to play around with it, it really shows how much needs to be done to meet temperature targets. So that shows the urgency too. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Kate. Jesse, before I hand over, Jesse and MaryJane, if you have something before I hand over to Maria and Jorge.
No, I'm fine.
Yeah, okay. I would say,
Okay.
yes, I am here. So we have actually not been very, very successful with the legislature, I must confess. There's a group of young people called the 350.org. I know it's an international body, but then has its national wing in Ghana, who have always been championing the issue about fossil fuel reduction in the country. We did that during the African Climate Week in Accra last year, March. I think basically this is the only group that is actually lobbying government and legislature in ensuring to understand that there's urgency for us to invest away from fossil fuel. But the fight has not been very successful because, again, as I indicated in my earlier submission, fossil fuel is tied to a lot of economic activities here in Ghana. So if you are asking that we invest away from that at the moment, okay, then we need an alternative that can equally get people employed as this does. So until we get that alternative, a better alternative, then of course we have to be progressive in our quest for investing away from fossil fuel. That's what I can say.
Yeah, and I think the same group was running the same campaign in Kenya on the Lamu coal, and yeah, they did quite a lot of advocacy then. Yes, so with that, I like to hand over to my colleagues, Maria and Jorge, for the next session.
Okay, so yep. So thank you very much. I very much like what I heard. I'm glad Katharine brought up tools such as Ambrose, which I think can help people a lot, starting to think about the problem and what the solutions are, what they look like, at what scale they need to be implemented, really start getting to tackle this problem. I want to add that it feels like people around here in Mexico don't listen to the science much. We haven't been able to convince our government about the costs and implications of investing on fossil fuels today and not having a green recovery to COVID-19. So based on that, it's hard to remain, optimistic. And it's something that I would really like to add is, a glimpse of what successes have been had around the world. So for all our panelists, I have the question about what have you seen as some of the key successes, maybe also some of the key challenges, but how can they be overcome? How can we work for specific policies? How can we, as young people, try to incorporate best practices that have been, proven to work around the world into our lobbying, our advocacy, for having inclusive financing for youth-led projects, or having a policy shift in our countries, or maybe reprioritizing certain projects within our own either national or regional governments, legislatures, etc. So I really want to hear about what your experiences are on the positive side and how to overcome some of the challenges you have faced in your experiences working within and with governments. So whoever wants to start, I think one of the last ones that spoke was Jesse. So maybe I would like to start with you.
Sure. Thanks for the question.
There's no problem.
I think just speaking in the U.S. context, and I think this is not news to a lot of youth activists, especially those who've been involved, excuse me, with the Extinction Rebellion protests and the push for a Green New Deal. Others refer to this. It's important to make the climate change argument not on the basis of climate change, but on the basis of equality and economics, because that's what reaches people. Most people, my organization, a lot of organizations spend a lot of time shouting about 1.5 degrees, which is very important, but no one knows what it means. Like it's in Celsius, and we don't use that system here, so it's especially confusing because 1.5 degrees has no moral element. It doesn't boil your blood. It doesn't get you excited. We need to talk about this concrete, daily ways that people understand it, and that's partially what the Green New Deal is. It's not leading with the climate message. It's leading with, if we don't do this, there's a jobs impact, there's a health impact, there's an equality impact, there's a community and racial impact to these changes that we need to understand, and we need to confront them throughout all of our policy tools. It's not just a carbon tax or a cap and trade system or a cap and dividend. It's about how we build buildings. It's about where we locate people, where we build low-income housing, how we address racial equity, because obviously poor people in the United States, as is the case, and especially poor and black and brown people all over the world, tend to live in places that are most affected by climate change first. And we've seen that with the flooding in Houston. We saw that during Hurricane Katrina. It's poor black and brown people that pay the price here, and that's not an accident. The system was designed that way to produce these outcomes. Now, it wasn't designed with climate change in mind. It was designed to relegate people to places where they have less likelihood of thriving under climate change. So making those arguments is really important. I think also bringing non-traditional allies is really important. I think, again, just speaking for the US, the environmental movement has long suffered from the fact that it is perceived as being white, wealthy, and coastal. And you can't build a broad movement on that basis. You need the interior of the country. You need non-white people. You need poor people, because again, they're feeling the impacts, but also to win elections, you can't win an election with a with a white, coastal, wealthy constituency. And environmental issues, I think, for too long were seen as a lifestyle choice. They still are here. Liberals do recycling. Liberals drive electric cars. Liberals do this. The way to break that perception is to actually have people from Louisiana, from factory towns in the Midwest, from people who don't look like climate activists, and I look like a climate activist demographically, is to bring those voices and elevate those voices, because without it, we risk making the mistakes of the past. And whatever you think of the environmental movement, it's got a lot of failures in the last 25 years to point to, and not a lot of big successes. Whereas in the 20 years prior, it had a lot of big successes to point to. So yeah, I'll just stop there.
Thank you, Jesse. I really appreciate bringing those topics. I think those are definitely key to bring into the conversation. In fact, here most of the conversation goes about fighting inequality, and I think for some reason the way that it's seen is let's fight inequality, let's invest more in fossil fuels. So I'm really interested in hearing about some of the successes too. If you have any examples, that would be great. If not, somebody else who wants to jump into the question, either I think
I can come back around. I'd rather hear other folks
himself. So
yeah.
Okay, perfect. Okay. So Kiran?
Yeah, I can speak to one of the things that I consider to be a success. So I first joined my MEP's office as a trainee, and then I went on to become an accredited parliamentary assistant. In that time, I have had many, many, many meetings with members of industry. And what is always so heartwarming is when you have members of industry come to you and say, we want to be a part of the climate movement. We're just not sure how. These are the plans we have in place. This is our 2050 plan. And sometimes it's from the companies where you wouldn't expect it at all. But it's always so heartwarming to know that these movements are taking hold to the point where companies and industries, they're realizing it's adapt or die. If you do not adapt to this Green New model, you will likely not survive in the future. Well, on a European scale at least. And that is extremely, extremely promising. So I'd say from all of my time working in the parliament, that is kind of what I consider one of the biggest successes. When it comes to kind of advice for youth inclusive green financing, I'd say the number one thing that you really need to do is do your research. You have to know exactly who you're approaching and what approach you're going to take with them. It makes absolutely no sense to approach a member of parliament, or for that matter, a member of Congress, who does not care about the topic that you're preaching. However, if you know that they are working on legislation for that topic, that is the right time to go to them, because they will be infinitely more interested in everything you have to say. So suppose that an MEP that you're approaching is working on low-income housing and providing green alternatives, so maybe solar-powered low-income housing. If you have a project that relates to that, and this is when this MEP is working on it, that is the time to approach them. You have to kind of strike at the time when you know the interest level is going to be at the highest. That doesn't mean that MEPs or members of Congress or politicians in general are not going to be interested in these topics in general. It's more of just, this is kind of the best way to maximize the interest level and frankly, the amount of traction that you're going to have with them.
Thank you very much for that. I really appreciate that answer. I think just to elaborate a little bit on it, one of the things that we have heard from scientists like Katharine, for example, is meet people where they are. And I think when it comes to Congress people, to people in parliament, people in government, and general decision-making positions, is we have to know them. We have to know what they care about, what they value, what they're fighting and advocating for, and meet them where they are. And propose projects that go that match well with that position. And then, as Jesse said earlier, have others tag along, have others, don't miss out. Kind of like picking on that fear of missing out that some people can have. It happens at the highest levels of decision making as well. So having others, pick on that initiative of, for example, what you were saying, the solar panel or housing in general, have others tag along, say this is working here. Bring the example elsewhere within their political party and interests, and have them move forward. I would also like to hear if Katharine or MaryJane have any success stories that they would like to share, or if you have any general advice to overcome some of the challenges you've seen. MaryJane? Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yes, I have a few of the success stories. Even though we have had a lot of challenges, we've had some successes as well. You know, in my initial submission, I made mention that especially within the Green Climate Fund or the multilateral funds, do not make way for the youth to be part or to be able to access those finances. And it's also partly because we do not have the technical capacity to be able to manage funds from the multilateral funds. And then also our understanding on the issue, just like Jesse mentioned, if you say 1.5 degrees, we need to reduce emissions by 1.5. What does it mean to the youth, or what the understanding of the issue? It's a bit of a challenge. And if you do not understand, you cannot make any meaningful contribution to the discussion if you are even given an opportunity to do so. So looking at these challenges, we, as an organization that I belong to, we've been able to lobby the NDA Secretariat to the GCF, that is the National Designation Authority in Ghana, to submit a readiness proposal to the GCF. And the idea is that, or the purpose is to get the youth organizations and the CSOs to understand the issues being discussed within the climate change negotiations. What do we mean by adaptation? What do we mean by mitigation? What do we mean by carbon financing? All of these things are issues that we need to understand. And unlike our European counterparts or those in the US, if you take a youth, okay, so our definition of youth is between 15 to 35. So if you take a 15-year-old girl or boy and ask the person about climate change or the environment, the understanding is very low as compared to the European youth within that same age bracket. So it's very important that for us to be able to engage properly, we also need to understand the issues. So again, as I said, this facility that we want to access through the NDA is going to help the youth organizations and then the CSOs to be able to understand the issues and then also engage the funds properly. That notwithstanding, we have also been able to successfully lobby the UNFCCC through our ACE national focal points to be able to establish what we call the African Youth Academy. It was in circulation a few months ago. We started last year, and then in February this year, we were able to have a meeting with the ACE focal point from Africa in Ghana to be able to structure the Youth Academy. And again, the challenge we faced was the fact that the Youth Academy was going to be an academy of all other groups of people. But thinking that the youth have been left behind for quite a long time, we had to lobby some of the ACE focal points in the room to be able to reason with us why the academy should be made for the youth. And so fortunately, that discussion has been ongoing. We've had a draft concept note of how the academy is going to look like. And it was actually supposed to be tabled at the next African Climate Week that was supposed to happen in Uganda this year, which unfortunately the COVID-19 disrupted. So it's still on hold, but we have the concept note for the Youth Academy. And some of the things the academy will be doing is to look at green businesses, incubator programs, leadership programs, and then knowledge sharing for the youth to be able to engage properly within the discussion of climate change at the national level and also at the global level. That is what we've been able to do. So I would say that these are a few successes we've been able to chalk with our experience in lobbying to be able to get something for the youth, because if not, the youth will be left out for a very long time. Let me also say that, again, one of the successes we have also chalked as far as my organization and then the Biodiversity Youth Network is concerned is that we initially, I know we are talking about climate change, but looking at the fact that we are preaching synergy between the real conventions and then the impact climate change has on biodiversity and biodiversity's contribution to climate change, we had to lobby the focal point of the CBD to be able to draft the national biodiversity policy. And interestingly, in that discussion, he saw reason with us why we cannot just do what we call the National Biodiversity Strategy Action Plan without a policy. We need a policy to drive the country because the action plans were time-bound. Even though policies will be time-bound, we felt that we need an overarching policy that the action plans will feed into. So we were able to lobby the primary focal point of the CBD in the country, and he saw reason with us why we should have a national biodiversity policy. And so during the policy formulation, something happened in the room, and we had a lot of our senior citizens in the room. In Ghana, when we say senior citizen in Africa, we mean our old, I would say our parents, because they are old, in the room, who were looking at, we're not even having the youth in mind. And so the discussion was just tailored to government, the role of government, the role of private sector, the role of CSOs. Fortunately, we had 2 of our members, in fact, 3 of our members in the room, including myself, and we had to lobby the former SSB focal point in Ghana to see reason with us why we need to have youth in the document, because our reason was that these are policies that will be implemented by the youth, and they are not, some of them may not be in the room to be able to implement the policy when it's rolled out because they were old. And so we felt that we were in the best position to be able to implement those policies. So we need to be given a role in the policy. We need to be recognized in the policy. And then they also need to make conscious effort that finance flow for the youth to be able to implement some biodiversity actions that we are already engaged in. So this discussion took us 2 days, and fortunately, we had the youth and financing incorporated in the draft policy. It's yet to be rolled out because Parliament has to sit on it to be able to agree on certain things within the policy before we finally adopt it. So these are some of the strides we've made as far as lobbying our government in ensuring youth inclusive financing is concerned. And it's happening in both ways, in all the real conventions. Yeah. And let me also say that we have had challenges though, but the challenge of the African youth, why we are mostly left out of the discussion or the engagement, is the fact that we lack some kind of technical capacity and mentorship. Because if you do not have the capacity, you do not understand the issues, you can't engage better. So I always say, which is a mantra, is that you can't give what you don't have. You can only give what you have. So if you are meeting your politicians or your leaders and trying to lobby for something, you need to understand what you are talking about to be able to lobby them further. And so the challenge has been very daunting, has been so enormous. And one other thing we have also realized as our challenge is that the regulatory frameworks, the legal frameworks, or the fiduciary requirements within the system is also not favorable for the youth, which I've mentioned already. So let me just pause here to say that we've had some successes, but again, we have challenges as well. So if you ask me, how then can we lobby for youth inclusive financing or policy, I would say that we should try as much as possible. It's enough. The strikes and demonstrations are enough. In Africa, the only institution, as far as my country is concerned, that can actually strike for government to listen is the health workers. Even though some teachers may go on strike and government will be seen pleasing them or doing or responding to their needs, the health workers are mainly the group of people that when they go on strike, government wants to respond to their needs for them to come back. But the youth movement, striking and demonstrating, has really not yielded any positive outcome for us, unlike maybe elsewhere in the global north. So I would say that striking is okay, demonstration is okay, but then it's enough. What we have to do is to go with something in hand. You must have something in hand, intercept your government at functions, at meetings, because here again, our political leaders do not just respond to emails. So if you sit in your office and you want them to respond to you through emails, they won't do that. So we need to meet them at where they are. Just as Kira said, you need to go to them. You need to meet them. Go to where you find them, their functions, or intercept them, maybe at church or a political rally or whatever. Just intercept them there and then hand them your request. And I think that there can also be an outcome. Something can be achieved from there also. I also want to say that we need to work collaboratively. We can't work in isolation. So it is very important that we also find like-minded youth organizations within where we find ourselves to be able to collaborate on some of these issues, to have a very impactful lobbying. Let me also add that one thing I've realized, just as Kira mentioned, in our case here in Ghana, we need to identify the appropriate ministries or departments and agencies engaged in what we are doing. So you can't have an issue on climate change and then you want to go and engage a ministry that is not engaged. So in Ghana, for instance, we will be dealing with the Ministry of Environment, the Ministry of Finance, and then the Environmental Protection Agency, where the focal point of the UNFCCC sits. So when we identify the institutions, then we can engage them better. And not just identify the institution, we need to establish key contacts with people who know how the system works. Sometimes you go to the ministry, there's someone there, front desk officer, whoever is there, you think you have maybe made contact with the person and you can just send your request or your letter or proposal to the person. That may not reach the authority you are looking for. So you need to get someone within the institution, establish contact, people who know the system, they know the peculiarities, and then they know the protocols as well to be able to guide you. And then we need to prepare adequately. We need to prepare adequately, researching into what the issues are, and then come up with concrete points or proposals for their consideration. So let me end by saying that in all of these, in our attempt to lobby for youth inclusive financing, we cannot do this in isolation, just as I said. Overcoming this barrier calls for multi-stakeholder approach. We need the government, we need the private sector, we need the civil society, we need our development partners to all come on board to be able to champion this cause. So I would say that sometimes it is also very important for us to use our embassies, the embassies of other nationals. You know, the climate finance flow comes from these developed countries. So if we really want to have youth in the disbursement of funds, or youth should be part of the financing, then of course we need to lobby the embassies in our countries to impress upon the governments to make sure that, just as they are making sure that we have gender in all projects and programs, then also the youth must be made an inclusive part of the project. So all ODAs or development assistance that will come to the country, they should tie youth engagement in that particular financing window, so that our government will be forced to include the youth. So once government is being forced by the donor to include the youth, then it is also important that government at the national level also impress upon the local government to be able to include the youth at the local level as well. So this is some of the ways I think we can lobby for youth inclusive financing. There are a lot, but I think that we can discuss this further through maybe emails or maybe another platform. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, MaryJane. I think, Katharine, do you have anything you would like to add to this question?
Yes, thank you. So I guess some of our biggest successes have been our representative co-sponsoring the bill, and then a handful of like local business and state legislator endorsements. And I guess it was weird when my congressman co-sponsored the bill. She hadn't really been showing any signs of like being more on board or anything. It must have just been like a political shift, and all of a sudden she announced she was a co-sponsor. So the political will is very important. So like before you go lobby, maybe go ask some friends to write a note to your congressman or your legislator in support of what you're asking for, and then deliver some notes, or like send some letters to the editor, op-eds to newspapers, and you could bring in a published copy of what you wrote in a newspaper or things like that. And also, Citizens Climate Lobby has some great lobbying training just for what to do when you're in the meeting. And some highlights from that are the approach that CCL uses that I think is very effective is to be polite and develop a relationship with the legislator, even if they don't agree with you. Like, instead of pushing for what you want nonstop right away, just let them talk, because that'll make them feel like they'll be happy to meet with you again because you listen to them, and just be ready to like meet with them again consistently. And then be clear about what you're asking for. A lot of times they say like they have these groups come in and like they talk about an issue, but they're not really sure what the group wants. So just state flat out, we want you to endorse this or like fund this or whatever the thing you'd like them to do is. And also the legislators are really busy. So even if you've met with them before, just ask if they need a refresher on the details of what you're talking about. They usually tend to. And then a really important thing is like when they have a concern about what you're asking for, to address their concern, it's really hard. Like, I don't know, my first instinct is just, well, this report found this actually, but like CCL recommends a way to answer this to like to make it go better, which it totally works. If it's really hard, but it works really well. So like, for example, if they, about carbon fee and dividend, if they say, well, I'm worried about low-income households in the transition to clean energy. So then like an example would be first state their concern to show you understand. So like I would say, you're concerned about low-income households when fossil fuel prices are getting more expensive. And then you want to share their concern, like that really matters to me too. I don't want to hurt the poor while we solve climate change. And then ask permission to like share what you've learned. So like, would you mind if I share what I've learned about how carbon fee and dividend will impact low-income households? And then go on to say like CCL commissioned a study that found 86% of the bottom fifth of households by income will come out ahead with carbon fee and dividend, receiving more in the dividend than they pay and higher prices to the fee. So that's just some approach tips.
Thank you very much, Catherine. I very much appreciate you bringing back the sort of the people and human side of things, having people contact and reach out to their representatives, bring in the notes, and listening to people and their concerns, including people from Congress, the government officials, etc. Jesse, earlier you wanted to circle back to you after everyone has mentioned.
If we're going to move to questions after this, we might as well. I think that's probably
okay. There was something I would like to add before handing it back to the other moderators. Mentioning what MaryJane said earlier. I strongly agree. If people don't have the capacity or if they don't understand the topic well enough, it's very hard and challenging for them to lobby people on the topic and move things forward. So the issue here is that these topics can be challenging, technically speaking, let alone understanding more about financing and the legal framework, especially for youth. So I would like to bring up an example that I think that perhaps could help, and it's often not seen as much in the climate advocacy because we focus so much on energy, but sustainable mobility, I think, has been a little bit of a success story right now during COVID-19 recovery and new normality. I think this can be youth-led. I think it already is in many ways. Historically, in the Netherlands, it was a youth-led movement, or the narrative was, since car accidents were affecting youth and children. It took a lot of people on the streets to make a change in their policies about how the transportation system works. And right now, due to the COVID-19 crisis, a lot of cities around the world started to make changes to their transportation systems started to invest specifically in cycling infrastructure, and this had ripples around the world. And I think this has already reached countries like Mexico, where people not necessarily have cared enough about the climate crisis, but because of the health crisis response, because it was an immediate threat, because it was something that became very relevant. We had many cities starting to have biking lanes, what they're called emerging biking lanes. And that can be used, that can be a narrative that we can pick up from the climate side of things. But again, focusing on the immediate problems, focusing on the priorities of constituents, of people, of government, and then we can have the financing. And going back also to contacting and reaching out to the embassies, I think the UK just launched a program right now to finance in around 4 different countries, Mexico included, sustainable projects. And I think mobility is going to be one of the top proposals for cities to implement in Mexico. And again, I would very much like to see more of this kind of projects. And I hope these programs can become use inclusive as part of their, setup from the get-go, be use inclusive and have the proposals include this vision. And again, this was just a kind of a topic that I think can be seen as a success story. And in general, we need to be thinking a little bit different in how we propose things moving forward, especially in the context of the COVID economic recovery. Kind of just as was mentioned earlier, the European Parliament is making climate change one of the key elements of the recovery, and it's not being led because of climate change. It's just a focus that they're giving to the COVID economic recovery. So I think it's very important to have that in mind. And with that, I will hand it over to, I think, Kiran, you want to add something to?
Yeah, definitely. So just on the topic of mobility, I just want to say that transport is definitely a major topic right now. And although it's important to kind of address road-based transportation or sea-based, air-based, whichever it is, it's equally important to address infrastructure for transportation, because without the correct green infrastructure, it is going to be extremely difficult to mainstream carbon neutral transportation. So whenever we're on the topic of mobility, I think one of the first things you really need to think of is, how can I change the infrastructure to allow for these structures to come in? Because without the proper infrastructure, it's going to be very difficult to kind of proceed forward. And then, yeah, again, agreeing with you, COVID definitely supercharged the EU Parliament's interest in climate, although even before that, it was definitely one of their key priorities, but now it is even more important.
Yeah, and one thing that I would like to add is the way transportation adds to the narrative. It's going back to what Jesse said, it's also about fighting inequality about prioritizing public transportation, prioritizing cycling, walking, that gives people access to goods and services, making a city that is walkable and livable for everybody, and that is designed for people, not for cars. That is a very important part of the narrative, and it goes into many governments and parties lines and what they advocate for. So it's a good way to include it. And transportation is responsible for very high percentage of emissions around the world. It can be the main cause of emissions in certain countries. Mexico is the case, for example. So I think it was an example that I wanted to, a good example that highlights many of the things that have been mentioned. And with that, I want to hand it back to Dolphine and Maria, who have some questions from the audience for all our panelists.
Yeah, so we definitely want to also get the audience involved, and we have a question from Mahip Sandhu. I'm going to just broadcast it here, and the question is, how can youth inclusive finance lobbying be approached specifically towards the energy transition, keeping in mind green recovery and the Green New Deal, and I'm not sure if this is a lady. They're asking this question specifically to Kiran and Jesse, because I know you're aware about the Green New Deal, and maybe this should be another topic for us to discuss in another session, because a lot of people have been asking us what is a Green New Deal and how do youth play a role in this?
Kiran, do you want to go first on that?
Yeah, sure. Sorry. Okay, so that's, yeah. Sorry, can everyone hear me? Yes, okay. So I think one of the key things to keep in mind for the EU, we have the European Green Deal and we have the Green Recovery, which the Green Deal is now a part of. So for us, the European Green Deal strives to make the Union climate neutral by 2050 at the absolute latest. So the key thing for us right now is investing in green initiatives and green businesses and green restructuring. So kind of going back to that whole infrastructure conversation, it's how can we make this a more climate neutral society, but also a more inclusive society so that we don't leave anyone behind in this transition using the Green Deal. And I think youth inclusive finance is extremely important here because, especially within the European Union, youth play a major, major part in this movement. Without the youth, I don't think this movement would have gotten as far. We completely recognize that this is going to affect our generation more than it has any past generation. So for us, this is clearly a priority, and we are working on a multitude of projects that relate to creating a more green economy, and therefore obviously would need financing. So I think the best way to kind of approach this specifically towards the energy transition is if you are a young person or if you are part of a youth organization that has an idea to create like an energy revolution or even just a business plan that, you know, uses alternative energies, renewables, hydrogen, whatever the case might be, find a politician or find people in business who are like-minded to you. Again, it goes right back to finding people and meeting them halfway. Honestly, the financing is there for the most part. It just has to be put towards a good idea, whether that idea is youth-led or not. But again, in many cases, I firmly believe that the climate movement would not have gotten as far as it has without youth constantly pushing and pushing and pushing and making politicians realize that this is what they want and this is important to them and therefore important to the vote.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, this is sort of implicit in Kiran's comments, but the EU is way far ahead of us in terms of they're moving legislation through the parliament. They're refining their proposal for a border carbon adjustment. This is all still theoretical in the United States for the most part, because the sitting president strongly opposes it. The sitting leadership of the United States Senate strongly opposes it. So there is no one Green New Deal in the United States. There's a broad framework, but there's a million plans that NGOs and different legislators are pushing. So there's no answer to what does the Green New Deal do for this or what does the Green New Deal not do for this. It's still very much being iterated, which is a dumb word people in NGOs like to use. Which means if there's something you care deeply about in this space, you can advocate for it. I am not aware of a big push to make sure that financing under the Green New Deal is youth sensitive. I don't doubt that it's going on. But I think right now it is more a question of individual sectors are trying to think through what the Green New Deal means for them. So what would the Green New Deal mean for housing? What would the Green New Deal mean for road infrastructure? What would the Green New Deal mean for proposals around universal basic income? So it's much more fundamental questions around policy design right now. And I think people can argue this point, but I don't think at least our political system right now is going to enact a Green New Deal all at once, both because it's very fragmented and partisan, but we've tried to do this before 10 years ago, tried to pass a big climate change bill that failed for a number of reasons. So to the extent the Green New Deal is enacted, unlike in the EU, it's going to be piecemeal. It's going to be thing by thing, sectoral approach, individual policy proposal. I think the appetite for big transformative single pieces of legislation in Congress right now is limited. So those are my thoughts.
Yeah, that's right.
And if I can just jump in.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
So if I can just jump in really quickly and add to
Yes.
that, I think what you have to consider is, despite the differences between the United States and the European Union, they are both societies that are made up of a multitude of opinions. And in some ways, although the European Union is made up of different countries, the United States has 50 different states and therefore kind of 50 different perspectives. So I think one of the really important things to take into consideration is that it's extremely difficult to have overarching change. Even within the European Union, different industries and different sectors have to react differently to our current Green Deal. And in fact, they are reacting differently to our current Green Deal. There are different approaches for them. And in fact, this legislation is separate from the Green Deal. It's called climate law, where we kind of strive to get industries on track by a certain amount of years. So say by 2030, we would have X amount of carbon restrictions, but this would be sort of based on a sectoral approach because every industry has different needs and therefore there's no one size fits all solution. So I think, again, for the United States, this is definitely going to be a bit more challenging and they are a bit behind due to their current sitting president. However, I guess we'll see what happens in November and where it goes from there. But yeah, I think honestly, something this big is extremely difficult to enact.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear both sides of the story because when we were in Spain last year, I think that's when they actually signed into action the Green Deal for the EU, and then that's when news about the Green New Deal started being spread around, and young people there were asking, oh, so now what does this mean in context for the US and things like that. So it's really interesting, Jesse, that you have elaborated for us to understand more about what is the Green New Deal. And I just want to turn to MaryJane and ask her a similar question, but it's for Agenda 2063. And if there are roadworks or there's a pathway for youth inclusion in Agenda 2063. And then I will hand over to Dolphine to take the other question.
We can't hear you, Mary.
Am I audible now? Okay. Okay, so the Agenda 2063, I would say that has some kind of youth inclusiveness in there. Because when you look at the agenda on education and then gender, they made mention of the youth in there. So just like others are doing, or within the SDGs, Agenda 2063 actually made the youth a part of it. Let me say that majority of the discussions or the issues raised in Agenda 2063 are, I would say, the carbon copy of what the SDG has produced. So there's no difference. The point of leaving no one behind is also expressed in the Agenda 2063, even though not in similar words, but then the fact that education for all is in there, the fact that gender, which includes the youth, also is in there. I would say that, yes, Agenda 2063 makes room for the youth.
Thank you very much, MaryJane. On that same point, sorry to pick on this Agenda 2063. Do you think, because I've had a rough look at the Agenda 2063, and I don't feel as if the aspect of climate change is really deeply engaged within that agenda. Do you think there is need to mainstream maybe climate change further into the African Agenda 2063, maybe mainstream into the Agenda 2063?
Okay. What I'll say is that it just that the word climate change may not exist, but then the issue of green economy and then blue economy, the health of the ocean is, and then yes, is actually clear in the Agenda 2063. So if you can pursue a green economy where you don't take into consideration climate change issues, So I'll say that Agenda 2063 has climate change, is climate change sensitive, I would say. That is what I can say, because the part on green economy, again, the blue economy, has to do with climate change or sustainable environmental management principles in there. So I can't entirely say that climate change is not there and that climate change has to be mainstream. Maybe what you are calling for is that the word climate change should find itself in there. But again, if you ask yourself, what does the principle of green economy means? What is green economy seeking to do? It is for us to transition from the business as usual to a more climate environment friendly business. It is asking us to decouple economic development from environmental degradation. It is asking us to ensure that our development is done in a path such that it does not impede the sustainability of the environment. So the scarcity of the environment is taken into consideration in the Agenda 2063 under blue and then green economy. So I should say that it should satisfy climate change in a way, just that maybe the name climate change is not appearing in there, does not entirely conclude that climate change is not within the Agenda 2063 and that we should fight for mainstreaming of climate change. That's what I'll say.
I think we'll take the questions, Maria. Question for Jesse. From my understanding of the conservative media, they have a tendency to demonize anything liberal. Is there something that we can do to not alienate the modern Republicans? So back to Jesse.
Yeah, boy, if I knew the answer, I would be a much wealthier person.
There is also There's also another question to clarify from some. What are some of the concrete things that we can do to reach out to moderate Republicans and not have them dismiss us as big government Democrats?
Yeah, it's a central challenge, obviously. Because of other folks have alluded to, there isn't really a debate, at least in most countries around the world, over the validity of climate science, but we have a debate over the validity of climate science here in the United States. It's very difficult to solve a problem in a bipartisan fashion when one party doesn't believe there's a problem. I think that's changing for obvious reasons. Climate disasters are getting more frequent and more severe. We see that reflected in the polling. You see some Republican members of Congress trying to find a way to talk about climate change in a way that they feel like they can own ideologically, but it's very tough. I think the places where Republicans are more willing to work with us is on research and development, trying to find path-breaking technologies. They're interested in conservation and energy efficiency, right? That's sort of a core conservative value, one would think. Saving energy, saving money, investing in natural spaces. There's a new vogue among House Republicans for planting trees, this thing called the Trillion Trees Initiative, which I believe to be nonsense, but at least they seem to sort of understand the idea of natural carbon sinks. The problem is that, and I've had Republicans on the Hill explain this to me, they feel like once they agree that climate is real, the science is real, the urgency is real, they feel like they have to consent to the Democratic climate agenda. They have to consent to carbon taxes and EPA regulations and the whole suite of policy tools that are generally within the mainstream of the Democratic Party to combat climate change. That's not true, but that's the main political barrier, is that the lack of a clear conservative Republican climate agenda prevents conservatives from working with us on the issue, because they see a capitulation on the science as a capitulation on the politics and the policy. So I think one way that people are trying to get Republicans involved is to make the argument on national security grounds, right? The idea that if we don't address climate change, it is a threat to our safety and our health. And, you know, if water competition and resource competition becomes more severe overseas, that threatens America's long-term interests all around the world. Faith groups are very active in this. Religious groups, churches, and church councils in the United States are very influential with Republicans, and a lot of them are increasingly active on climate change. They refer to it as creation care, the idea that God created the earth, we should care for God's endowment in the earth. Climate change is arguably the biggest threat to the earth right now, inarguably. I don't know why I'm saying arguably. But it's a tough nut to crack because, as I was referring to, 45 minutes ago, this is seen as a partisan issue in most communities in the United States. Liberals care about climate change, conservatives don't. And if you start talking about climate change, there's a very famous, not very famous, but a somewhat famous member of Congress, a Republican member of Congress from South Carolina, who authored his own carbon capping bill and then lost his primary. And he is seen as sort of the example of why Republicans don't want to put a foot into the climate change debate, because not only is it bad politics, but they won't be in Congress anymore because their party sees no value in working on those issues. So I could go on about this topic for 45 minutes, but it's a really important one to think about because we can't do this without bringing the rest of the country along.
I think those are very great points from Jose and also the rest of our speakers. At this juncture, I'll hand over to Maria.
Yeah, I just wanted to say it's been a very interesting and thought-provoking session, especially like understanding lobbying, not just as nationally, but also like the different parties or stakeholders that are involved and how to navigate that and how to work with them. And I really just want to thank you all for being here. I don't know if you have like any last words you want to any last piece of advice you want to give. If not, we shall obviously be sharing this recording with the youth constituency. It will be available both on Facebook and YouTube. And I just want to say thank you again. I've learned a lot personally, I know. And hopefully we can get to work together in lobbying for climate. So with that, I will close the session and wish everyone a wonderful day, evening, morning, afternoon. Bye.
Thank
Thanks
you.
for having us.